Hey guys and gals, it's your buddy Drew with Living History's Mysteries and Ferocious Feline Productions. You know, at the close of the Civil War and the beginning of the Reconstruction era, things were supposed to change for the African American culture. Granted, at that time they still weren't given all the rights as white citizens were, but they were starting to get a few, and it was all going to change with time, and people knew that. Just 45 years later, it wasn't the raciality of individuals that the African American culture had to worry about. It was scientific raciality. And a few certain individuals were taken advantage of either as freaks or scientific curiosity. I'll tell you what. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. I'm going to let you check this out. It talks a lot about the whole part of scientific raciality. But it talks about one individual in particular and his sad story. Check this out. This is good.
An outrage. The Negro race in America has a hard enough time as it is in getting away from the prejudice that's closely related to the monkey without having a member of the race placed on exhibition.
Leading men of science from Harvard and Princeton and Columbia University was saying that Africans were midway between an orangutan and a human being, so 100 years later, it should not come as much of a surprise that many people still cling to these notions of European superiority, African inferiority.
Was 1859. 3 months after Charles Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species, American promoter P.T. Barnum unveiled a new attraction at his popular museum in New York City. It featured what was described as the What Is It, or man monkey. Visitors were told that the creature had been captured by hunters in Africa, who discovered a race of beings roving among the trees and branches like apes and monkeys. Museum staff declared that the creature had been pronounced by scientists as a connecting link between African blacks and lower animals. In reality, Barnum's so-called man monkey was an African-American man named William Henry Johnson. Thanks to Barnum, Johnson spent much of his life on public display as an evolutionary missing link, sometimes in a cage. Many reporters at the time were happy to promote the deception. The New York Tribune declared that Barnum's performer seemed to be a cross between an ape species and a Negro, while another paper declared,
"The head is shaped like that of a monkey, but the face is more like that of an African Negro of the lower order. It has been pronounced by naturalists as a specimen of the connecting link between man and monkey."
Many more supposed missing links were marketed to the public at freak shows throughout America. In the 1880s, there was Crow, promoted as living proof of Darwin's theory of the descent of man. She was described as a perfect specimen of the step between man and monkey. Actually, Crow was a young woman from Southeast Asia who suffered from hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition that produces excessive hair. In the early 1900s, there was Congo, the ape man, usually exhibited in a cage next to a chimpanzee. Most of these early presentations of missing links were crude hoaxes put forward by hucksters, not scientists. But the quest to dramatize the lower stages of human evolution eventually reached far beyond freak shows. It ultimately involved the most elite members of the scientific community, and it was given a platform at one of the most celebrated events in early 20th century America. Today, Forest Park in St. Louis is a place for walking, or riding a bicycle, or spending a quiet Sunday afternoon. But more than a century ago, it was one of the most visited locations in the entire United States, the site of the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Attracting more than 19 million visitors, the World's Fair was known for its lavish neoclassical buildings, its 22-story-high Ferris wheel, and the public debut of innovations such as the X-ray machine and the ice cream cone. But the fair had a darker side. Organizers imported thousands of indigenous peoples from around the world to be put on public display in what was essentially a giant human zoo. Unlike freak shows, the human zoo in St. Louis was created with the cooperation of America's scientific establishment. The man behind the human zoo was anthropologist William McGee. One of the nation's leading scientists, McGee had already served as acting president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 1903, he was asked to head the anthropology department for the World's Fair. McGee had grand plans of presenting the story of human evolution by displaying representatives of what he considered lower stages of the human race. McGee's plans reflected the ideas of mainstream anthropology of the time.
Anthropology was kind of founded on this idea of mapping civilization from the highest to the lowest, right? With the lowest at that time said to be Africans, and then you sort of move up. Leading men of science from Harvard and Princeton and Columbia University were saying that Africans were midway between an orangutan and a human being.
Like many scientists of his day, McGee drew inspiration for his ideas on human development from Darwin's theory that humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors.
Darwin's theory provided a template for categorizing Africans as biological inferiors. His impact created a bandwagon effect on many scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. Africans were demeaned with terms like savages and compared to animals. Admittedly, some of these comparisons were used before Darwin, but after Darwin, they increasingly took on the authority of science.
Darwin argued that the break in evolutionary history between apes and men came between Africans and Australian Aborigines and gorillas. In other words, he thought blacks were the closest humans to apes. German scientist Ernst Haeckel helped popularize the idea.
Ernst Haeckel was the leading German Darwinist in the late 19th and early 20th century. He corresponded extensively with Darwin, and Darwin recognized Haeckel's affinity with his own theory.
Ernst Haeckel also is known for his raving racism. And in fact, he had a graphic of the history of human evolution that, in very pointed terms, really embedded a racist view of human evolution. You had the Teutonic male on the top, the sort of the Germanic male, and then at the bottom you had some creatures that looked partly like apes, partly like Jews. He was also anti-Semitic. And in the middle, you had the transition from the ape-like creatures to the first human creatures. The ape-like creatures look pretty much like they're Africans. And the takeaway point that Ernst Haeckel had from this graph was that the difference between the highest human being and the lowest human being, the gap between the highest Teutonic male and the first human being that was just one step above the apes, was larger than the gap between the lowest human being and the highest ape.
At the St. Louis World Fair, William McGee expressed a similar view. Like other scientists of the era, McGee saw primitive non-white peoples as living evidence of man's evolutionary history.
The savage stands strikingly close to subhuman species in every aspect of mentality, as well as in bodily habits and bodily structure.
McGee was determined to use primitive peoples at the fair to dramatize for the public the different stages of human evolution, beginning with races he considered lowest on the evolutionary scale. McGee arranged for native peoples to be put on display in villages designed to recreate their native habitats. These villages were enclosed by fences, making them truly seem like human zoos. More than 4 million fairgoers reportedly visited these anthropological displays, eagerly staring at and poking at the indigenous peoples in their enclosures. Adding to the indignities, native peoples were pressured to participate in a series of athletic contests designed to show they were biologically inferior to whites. Those on display were also subjected to experiments in a special laboratory set up by the fair's anthropology department. Directed by a psychology professor from Columbia University, the lab conducted tests to measure native people's intelligence and physical features, and even their threshold for pain. Some scientists came to the fair with more gruesome plans. Alish Hrdlichka was an anthropologist at the Smithsonian. He came to St. Louis hunting for dead bodies. Hrdlichka was obsessed with analyzing the brains of other races to gain insight into human evolution. He went on to assemble a collection of hundreds of embalmed human brains, many of them still stored by the Smithsonian. Hrdlichka extracted a promise from doctors in St. Louis to hand over the brains of any of the natives who might die while on display at the fair. Native peoples were brought to the St. Louis exposition from the far corners of the globe. From Japan came representatives of the Ainu people. Patagonians came from South America. Igorots and Negritos came from the Philippines. Both were thought by scientists of the time to be near the bottom of the evolutionary ladder for humans. The Negritos were even marketed at the fair as another missing link between humans and apes. But perhaps the most exotic people group brought to St. Louis for public display were pygmies from the African Congo.
Will the pygmies brought last week to the World's Fair prove Darwin's theory of the missing link? Will a study of the little black children of the African jungles shed light on the theory evolved by Darwin as regards the evolution of the human race? Dr. W.J. McGee, chief of the anthropology department of the World's Fair, is convinced that it will. This is the first time that the Aboriginal people of Africa have been brought to an English-speaking country. This is the first opportunity that has been presented to scientists to study them. Many characteristics were noticed in the pygmies that closely resemble the ape or the simian type. It is believed that the pygmies, who are said to represent the lowest form of human development, are next removed from the simian family.
The pygmies appear appearing at the St. Louis World's Fair had been transported from Africa by former missionary turned explorer Samuel Phillips Verner. Verner had gone to Africa with the explicit goal of finding pygmies to display at the fair.
He had gone to the Congo heavily armed, and he had gone hunting for these people called pygmies, these diminutive people of the Central African forest.
The fair's anthropologist William McGee repeatedly compared the pygmies to monkeys and apes. In the journal Science, he even asserted that pygmies were commonly considered to approach subhuman types more closely than any other variety of the genus Homo.
They were considered by men of science at that time to be the lowest form of humans, or in some thought they were subhuman.
The pygmies were less than thrilled by their welcome at the fair.
The Americans treat us as they do our pet monkey. They laugh at us and poke their umbrellas into our faces. They do the same to our monkey.
One pygmy at the fair became a special celebrity. His name was Ota Benga. Samuel Verner had purchased him at a slave market. Ota Benga was advertised to fairgoers as the only genuine African cannibal in America today. For a nickel, he would display his pointed teeth that supposedly enabled him to eat human flesh. At the end of the fair, the pygmies returned to Africa with Samuel Verner. But in 1906, Verner brought Ota Benga back to America. It would prove a fateful choice. Samuel Verner returned from Africa to New York City on July the 30th, 1906, arriving on the SS Armenian from Liverpool. He was accompanied by 2 chimpanzees, a snake, a parrot, and 50 boxes of materials from Africa that he hoped to sell to museums. He was also joined by Ota Benga. Verner quickly departed New York, leaving Benga at the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. Established in 1869, the museum was already becoming one of the premier scientific institutions in the world. Ota Benga was largely left free to wander the museum's exhibit halls. When Samuel Verner eventually returned to New York, he was fighting off predators, and the museum wanted him to find new lodgings for Ota Benga. So Verner worked out an agreement to move Ota Benga to the New York Zoological Park, otherwise known as the Bronx Zoo. Spread over more than 260 acres, the Bronx Zoo had been envisioned by its founders as the largest zoo in the world and the grandest zoological establishment on Earth. The zoo was directed by William Temple Hornaday. A noted zoologist, Hornaday formerly worked at the Smithsonian, and he had already founded the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Overseeing Hornaday was an executive committee chaired by Henry Fairfield Osborn, a distinguished professor at Columbia University. Hornaday and Osborn had dreams of exhibiting more than just animals at their new zoo. Both wanted to install Native Americans on zoo grounds, with Osborn promising that one day the Indian and his teepee would take their place next to the Zoological Park's buffalo. Now they had their chance to put their first human on display. Hornaday quickly agreed to purchase one of Verner's chimpanzees and to house both the chimp and Ota Benga at the zoo. Hornaday planned to exhibit the pygmy and the chimpanzee together in a cage in the zoo's monkey house.
It was presented as science, not as a circus act, because these were men of science who were doing this.
Ota Benga went on display in the monkey house on Saturday, September the 8th, 1906. The next day, a sign was placed on the cage explaining the new exhibit.
The African pygmy, Ota Benga. Age 23 years. Height 4 feet 11 inches. Weight 103 pounds. Brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State. Exhibited each afternoon during September.
Thousands of New Yorkers came to stare and laugh and debate the meaning of the display. Is it a man? Some of them wondered. News newspaper coverage brought even more people, and in just a few weeks, the zoo drew nearly 250,000 visitors. But the notoriety also brought controversy. New York's clergy, in particular, were horrified at what they saw as a dehumanizing spectacle. First to speak out was the Reverend Robert Stewart MacArthur, pastor of the city's Calvary Baptist Church, one of the largest Baptist congregations in America.
The person responsible for this exhibition degrades himself as much as he does the African. Instead of making a beast of this little fellow, he should be put in school.
Ministers from New York's African American community soon organized a protest committee. After visiting the zoo and seeing Benga for themselves, they were horrified.
They thought it was outrageous. They clearly saw a human being who appeared to be afraid, who was being heckled and jeered at and things thrown at him, and he was being, debased on the hallowed grounds of the New York Zoological Society in New York City.
The ministers demanded that Ota Benga be taken off display and be offered an education. James H. Gordon, superintendent of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, appealed to the zoo to end the spectacle.
If Professor Werner found difficulty in disposing of the boy, why did he not apply to us? We would have seen that he was well cared for.
Gordon also denounced the way the young African was being used as a prop to prove Darwinian evolution.
This is a Christian country, and the exhibition evidently aims to be a demonstration of the Darwinian theory of evolution. Neither the Negro nor the white man is related to the monkey. Such an exhibition only degrades a human being's manhood. We do not like this exhibition of one of our race with the monkeys. Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls.
Samuel Werner tried to deflect the criticism, denying that he put Ota Benga on display to show that he was somehow subhuman.
If Ota Benga is in a cage, he is only there to look after the animals.
Zoo director Hornaday meanwhile declared that the black minister's protest was ridiculous.
Though a believer myself in the Darwinian theory, I had no idea of using the exhibition to enforce it. The boy is on exhibition simply because the public wishes to see him. He is well treated and happy. To say that the boy is placed in the cage to show his similarities to the monkey is nonsense. He is much more intelligent than many white men whom I have known.
Hornaday made clear that he wasn't about to shut down the popular exhibit.
The exhibition shall certainly be continued, unless the directors of the park decide otherwise.
But the leaders of the New York Zoological Society were pleased by the display. Henry Fairfield Osborne even congratulated Hornaday for the excellent press coverage, commenting that Benga is certainly making his way successfully as a sensation. Spurned by Hornaday, the African-American ministers decided to appeal to George McClellan Jr., the Democratic mayor of New York. McClellan was the son of the controversial general during the Civil War, who had tried to unseat Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election of 1864. The elder McClellan openly confessed that he was prejudiced in favor of the white race, and said that he couldn't learn to like the odor of either billy goats or Negroes. The younger McClellan now refused to even meet with the African-American ministers, sending out an assistant with a dismissive note referring them to the New York Zoological Society. The ministers then went to see Madison Grant, the Zoological Society's secretary. Grant was a prominent member of New York Society. A graduate of Yale, he received a law degree from Columbia. He was also a trustee of the American Museum of Natural History, a counselor of the American Geographical Society, and a founder of the Bronx Zoo. It would have been hard for the ministers to find someone less sympathetic. Grant was an open racist who thought blacks were an inferior race and regarded those who had parents of different races as mongrels. Within a decade, he would write The Passing of the Great Race, a book which championed Nordic supremacy and keeping blacks subservient to whites. The book was reportedly praised by Adolf Hitler as his Bible. Grant also rebuffed the ministers. So did the city's most prominent newspaper, the New York Times, which professed to be puzzled by the anger of the protesters.
We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in the matter.
Describing African pygmies as very low in the human scale, the Times made clear that it viewed pygmies as less than fully human.
Whether they are really closer to the anthropoid apes than the other African savages, or whether they are viewed as the degenerate descendants of ordinary Negroes, they are of equal interest to the student of ethnology and can be studied with profit.
The editors at the Times thought it absurd to make moan over the imagined humiliation and degradation Ota Benga was suffering. In fact, they claimed the pygmy was probably enjoying himself.
The suggestion that Benga should be placed in a school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place of torture to him, and one from which he could draw no advantage whatever. The idea that men are all much alike except as they have had or lacked opportunities for getting an education out of books is now far out of date.
After African American ministers criticized the zoo for trying to use Ota Benga to prove Darwinian evolution, the New York Times weighed in again.
The Reverend Colored Brother should be told that evolution, in one form or another, is now taught in the textbooks of all the schools, and that it is no more debatable than the multiplication table.
As protests continued, increasingly rowdy crowds came to the zoo in order to visit the pygmy. On Sunday, September 16th, 40,000 people converged on zoo grounds to see the city's newest sensation. According to press reports, the mobs chased Ota Benga around the zoo all day, howling, jeering and yelling. Some of them poked him in the ribs, others tripped him. All laughed at him. Benga responded by shooting an arrow at his tormentors, after which zookeepers caught him and returned him to his cage. As both crowds and Ota Benga became unruly, zoo director Hornaday grew increasingly defensive. He now claimed that he had decided to exhibit Ota Benga in a cage simply for convenience.
We have no platform that we could place him on, and this big open-air cage was the best place we could find to put him where everybody could see him.
Eventually, the continued controversy made Hornaday want to wash his hands of the whole affair. Ultimately, an agreement was reached to move Ota Benga to the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum and later to a seminary in Lynchburg, Virginia. There, nearly 10 years later, Ota Benga shot himself to death. Benga had expressed a desire to return to his native Africa, but by 1916, the continent was being further ravaged by European powers as they fought World War I, so return was no longer an option.
I think the hopelessness of it all, the trauma he had sustained, the loneliness, and, I can't even imagine. He had no idea what had become of his people, if his village was still even there. So it's not hard to imagine the myriad reasons why he would have sunk into this deep depression and that ultimately caused him to take his life.
In one final indignity, the New York Times published an obituary assuring readers that during Ota Benga's stay in their city, he was actually an employee of the Bronx Zoo who had been hired to feed the apes. According to the Times, it was this employment that gave rise to the unfounded report that Ota Benga was being held in the park as one of the exhibits in the monkey cage. Ota Benga was largely forgotten by history until the 1990s. But the passion of social Darwinists in America for putting humans on display continued. And 15 years later, some of the same figures involved in the Ota Benga scandal would be involved in another kind of human display, one whose impact would prove even more horrifying.
Welcome back. It's like I said in the beginning. At the beginning of the 20th century, Yes, there were African Americans that were holding some very prestigious positions, and there were others from far off lands that were taken advantage of for the entertainment, for benefit, financial benefit, even for science. I'd like to think that we've changed as a culture, as a world, since the sad happenings with Ota Benga. And it seems like every time that I see 3 or 4 really good things happen with civil rights or between the different cultures, something always comes up and it takes away all that happiness and joy. Is the world as a whole ever going to be one? Just one people, one race, humankind, mankind, womankind? Maybe not in our lifetime. But I look at the changes that have occurred in the last 100 years, 160 years. One time, maybe in the time of my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren, that we may see a unified world and one unified race. That's all I've got for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this look back into history and the sad story that went along with it. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. God bless you. God love you. We do. We'll see you in history.